Okay. This microphone's not working the best in the world, so holding it a little close. But hey, good morning. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Matt Quisenberry. I'm the Feasibility Studies Unit Manager, and I'm kind of serving in two roles here this morning. I'm both your moderator for this session. I'm also a speaker as well, and as speaker, I'm also riding on the coattails of my co-presenter, John Jameson here, who it's been great working with. And so just the title of the session is Unit Highlights, Environmental and FSU Updates, with mine being a focus on more the environmental aspects of Feasibility Studies Unit, being paired here with John. And before I get started, have a couple of quick reminders. There will be a Q&A session at the very end. We're going to hold off until the very end after both me and John spoke to do the Q&A. And then also, we will have a QR code to sign in for the PDHs. It will be on the screen at the end of the session. And then we'll also have a printout up here up front you can come to after the session is over. So without further delay, we'll jump into it, and I'll hand it off from me to myself. Okay, so my session is going to be on the overall project scoping process with a focus on environmental screening during project initiation. And especially, and for those you don't know, project initiation is kind of the early stages of a project's life cycle in stage one of the project delivery network. And I'll jump into that here shortly. So my presentation will overall be short. And I'll start by discussing what the project scoping process is before transitioning to the environmental considerations that should take place during the development of an express design or project scoping report. I'll close by discussing our outlook for the future with regards to environmental planning during project scoping. And so the work completed by the Feasibility Studies Unit primarily takes place during stage one of the project delivery network. Our unit is responsible for investigating potential STIP projects that are viable and are likely to become programmed, or projects that are programmed already and need its scope and cost better defined. Our goals in this stage of the project delivery network are to identify and document a project's need and purpose, and to do so in coordination with local stakeholders, to determine viable alternatives and alignments for proposed projects. And we must evaluate if conceptual designs will address project goals, and to eliminate design alternatives that either do not meet these goals or are not feasible. And it's especially important that we identify and document fatal flaws for a project early on in this stage. It's one of the key things we're trying to identify here. And so through this project scoping process, not only will we develop a better cost estimate, but we're also looking to minimize project risk and future surprises for a project as it moves on downstream. And so thus far, you may have noticed that I've been using the phrasing project initiation or project scoping process. And more so, you may have noticed that I've not been using the phrase feasibility study unless referring to the title of my own unit. And so that's because I must clarify some phrases that I still receive questions about today. Feasibility studies are no longer called, well, feasibility studies. It's referred to overall as the project scoping process. And this is reflective of a change that the department undertook about 5 years ago as part of the integrated project delivery effort. The project scoping process is completed in 2 phases: the express design evaluation as the first phase, and the project scoping, producing project scoping report in the second phase. And so the express design evaluation will investigate conceptual design options and prepare costs needed for the project to go through the prioritization and programming process. And then when or if the project is programmed for preliminary engineering only in the STIP, then the project scoping report will be initiated. And we can also initiate this earlier if needed for some of our larger projects that need the extra level of effort even before prioritization submittal. And so the project scoping report will provide project background, more detailed environmental screening data, and documentation for NCDOT management to use in determining how the project will proceed into project development. Ultimately, the final product is the project scoping report, being the second item, which is a compilation of all the information gathered and prepared as part of this process. And so to clarify what the project scoping process is, it is an initial step in the planning design process for a candidate project. It describes the project, it estimates preliminary cost, and identifies any potential problems. It investigates conceptual design options and prepares costs needed for the prioritization process and spot. It is an alternative, not the alternative that we're locking into going on downstream. And equally as important in my mind is to understand what something is, you have to also state what it is not. And so the process is not detailed engineering, it's not in-depth data collection or field studies, and most importantly for purposes of presentation, it is not NEPA, SEPA environmental compliance documentation. I'm sure John would be glad to hear me say that. So additional features to improve project delivery include initial mapping limits for photogrammetry and surveying, constructability and a maintenance of traffic discussion, including a narrative, and even additional design for projects with constructability challenges to show impacts and cost, such as temporary detours, walls, bridges, etc. We also include an initial hydraulic review. We can initiate crash analysis data. The express design traffic evaluation is something we can do for certain projects that have a traffic need driving the purpose. And most importantly, at least for the purposes of this presentation, environmental screening. Okay. Where am I? Hold on. Sorry, for those of you who don't know, this laptop is a little weird for me, and I lost myself briefly. Okay. So we've now segued into the second half of this presentation that will focus on environmental considerations during the project scoping process. So during this section, I will try to thread a needle between two extremes. On one hand, I want you to be aware of environmental considerations in our project scoping process guidance and the success that we've had with regards to accounting for environmental concerns during the planning process. On the other hand, I want to close by acknowledging that I believe there are opportunities for improvement. I can cover a couple of ideas I have for improving environmental considerations, but ultimately, my number one goal is to set the stage for future engagement with you so that I can listen to your ideas. My hope is that the appeal of listening to John brought you into this session, especially if you're an environmental practitioner, and therefore that I'd have a lot of people in this room more knowledgeable than me on environmental planning best practices who can help us improve. And so looking at this slide here, if you just Google project scope, like NCDOT Connect project scoping guidance, our guidance document will come up, and it's that hyperlink right there. Has all of our best practice information, can answer most any questions you might have. And so if you look in this process guidance, you'll find some key steps, some key process steps that focus on environmental considerations. And that includes data collection and project history, project need and purpose, stakeholder coordination during concept development, atlas screening, environmental features map, and then environmental document recommendations. And so first and foremost, in the project scoping process, data collection and project history. And during this step, we identify and document relevant data integrate previous planning documents, and tailor our efforts based on project. And so data collection is one of those things that can oftentimes be overlooked, but it's critically important. It's that first step on the road. And so it allows us to understand the background and context of the project. And so through this step, we can learn what work was completed during long-range transportation planning, whether it be a comprehensive transportation plan or a metropolitan transportation plan, or any other relevant documents. We can learn about the background of the project that led to the submitter's desire to submit this project in the spot or to consider submitting it in the spot. We can collect traffic information, crash data, and other applicable information if relevant. And we can begin to compile data of environmental constraints. And so it's in this step that we must learn what information is missing, what level of effort is needed to ensure that the project need is truly driving the project purpose, and what level of effort is needed to verify project constraints within the study area. And so looking, sets up a good transition to project need and purpose. Note, I'm intentionally saying the phrasing backwards just so I don't confuse with the official purpose and need statement, because this is not official NEPA compliance purpose and need. So just I'm trying to go my way with how I'm phrasing this and stating this here. And so first and foremost, we always want to identify the need that is driving the project's purpose. We want to document that purpose, the need, and supporting data. Always important to have supporting data that's guiding that. And we want to determine if this is a short-term or long-term need, because as we get into discussions on the viability of the project and the solution, we got to know what it is we're planning for. And sometimes that has major impacts in our discussions and on how much we need to build out that concept that we're looking at. And so having that understanding of short-term or long-term need as agreed upon by our local stakeholders is very important, especially the submitters and those looking at it. And so this step, yeah, it's very important. An example I'll give that comes to my mind a lot is a lot of what I see as a spot. When you submit a project in a spot, you can state what the project purpose is. And sometimes folks have gotten really good at giving me a lot of good PR buzzwords for a lot of different purposes. And a lot of times, at least in my experiences, if you give me everything, you give me nothing, so to speak, because I don't really know what the need is driving your project. And so everyone wants safety, but and it gets back to that issue at data, is there safety data driving this project as the primary purpose of the project? Because if so, if we're looking at access management improvements for the facility, then that's a big difference. If traffic is driving it, then we want to lean towards maybe a reduced conflict intersection corridor. But if it's truly safety, then maybe we don't need a reduced conflict intersection. Maybe it's just adding medians in certain areas where you're having crash issues. And so it's always important to have clear consensus with your stakeholders on what is the driving need for this project purpose, and not only identifying that, but then documenting it, because, and that segues into the next slide, because it's very important that we engage stakeholders during this process. And so first and foremost, we have a kickoff meeting during the project scoping process. And I can't overstate how important this meeting is. This might be the first time that you get some of these folks from metropolitan planning organizations or rural planning organizations or other local governments into the same room or virtual room since they did maybe their comprehensive transportation plan or gone through the long range planning process. And so this is the opportunity, and it's not only getting in the room, it's getting your local DOT divisions, it's getting your experts from various DOT units, other relevant stakeholders, getting all in the same room to really get on the same page about the project's need, purpose, and desired concept. And so, and even if we can't get them all in that one room, we do try our best we have opportunities for additional one-on-one outreach to stakeholders based on the project context needed. We are pretty good at tracking people down, I'd like to think. And then we have an express design coordination log and preliminary coordination questionnaire provided to help document responses as needed, and more information on those templates can be provided in our guidance documentation. And we also have, during this, we also look to coordinate and draft conceptual maps provided them to review and comment. And when we are ready for the draft express design to be completed, we typically have a 3-week review turnaround time frame, and it's very important, as spelled out in our guidance, that we include all local stakeholders in that, and that we document the feedback received for that so it can hand off nicely to those of you who are environmental practitioners or project development engineers later on downstream. And so that's a requirement prior to finalizing the express design. And so with regards to the environmental features map, part of our process is overlaying the conceptual design options on an environmental features map, as well as generating an Atlas screening report. And so reviewing this information with stakeholders to determine what is viable relative to constraints, whether that be human constraints or natural constraints. And so, yeah, we want to review that the concept is fully feasible at this stage. It goes back in that theme of identifying fatal flaws and identifying why an alternative might be viable or possible reasons why it might not be viable downstream. And if something truly isn't something that should be pursued or considered later on, then making sure we document why that is. And so then, very important in our process is documenting what those recommendations are. And so we have recommendations that we provide for the overall project, but we always sprinkle in or make sure we're working in the environmental considerations into those overall project recommendations. And so just here are a couple examples here, and it might be tough to read, but on the right side is from a project initiation form, and that's the document used as documentation for the express design, that first step in the project scoping process. And so here, off the side, it states in this particular project that a type 3 categorical exclusion would be advised for this project if it's federally funded, or minimum criteria determination checklist if it's state funded, as well as additional context on the project, including considerations. It might not state it there explicitly, but it's elsewhere in the document, just environmental considerations completed during the course of that project planning. And then on the bottom is a project scoping report example. And so here it states that low level of, there was a low level of anticipated impacts. And so therefore, a state minimum criteria determination checklist or federal categorical exclusion is recommended in that particular instance. And one thing I'll mention as well is that included in the project scoping report template is not only do we have the recommendation section that's overall recommendations for a project, but we also have a section that is explicitly the NEPA / section 404 recommendations that draw strong attention to it, and it's always right around there at the end with the recommendation section. So we really want to go of our way to truly draw people's attention to what the recommendations are based on environmental considerations coming in out of this process, so we can set the stage for an effective handing off of the baton from this early planning that we're doing onwards to project development. And so the benefits of the overall project scoping process are that we can better define project scope based on identified need, that we can develop concepts that are context sensitive relative to stakeholder feedback and constraints, whether they be human or natural, that we can jumpstart environmental planning process. And when I say jumpstart, we are very flexible in how we've set our procedures and guidance. In most cases, it's just what I mentioned. It's not NEPA-SEPA compliance documentation. It's more so having NEPA-SEPA appropriate documentation that can be provided or hand off. But we've left some room open so that if come project support, if maybe it's a really high priority complex project that we know, hey, this is going to require extensive coordination and have extensive environmental constraints, we could technically, we've left open our guidance that we could theoretically start doing NEPA-SEPA official, we go through merger even, beginning there. And I don't know, John, if we've had any of those yet, but we've left it open for there one day if that's needed. So I just want to draw attention to that. And so, and then also through this process, it provides for a more documented project detail for future activities, whether that be project development or subsequent prioritization rounds if the project has to go through prioritization again. And so looking ahead, the feasibility studies unit is actively identifying enhancements to the current process. And this gets back to what I was saying earlier. There's a lot of successes that we've had with regards to documenting NEPA-SEPA appropriate documentation, environmental considerations we do through this process, but we also recognize that, yeah, there's opportunities to improve, and that's based on some reviews I've done as well as conversations I've had with some of you. And so I'd be remiss if I didn't take advantage of this opportunity to be here with you guys who are probably here to listen to John, who are knowledgeable on environmental planning and that whole world, and not at least tee it up to say, I need y'all's help with reaching out to me afterwards and helping guide me, because we are looking at ways we can improve. And so potential enhancement ideas that I've been discussing with various folks, and this is something I even discussed with some MPO and RPO representatives the other day, and it got some good feedback from them, was stronger requirements for our kickoff meeting summaries to consistently document key items. And as I mentioned earlier, those kickoff meetings are very valuable. Like, it's our first opportunity to get back in the same room again with some of these stakeholders. Might not have been together in a room maybe ever, or maybe since doing long-range planning. We can't lose out on that golden opportunity. We got to make sure that we're truly documenting the appropriate things that come out of that meeting to help out going on downstream. It's kind of the choke point where you can do it. And so, yeah, so we do meeting summaries most of the time for those meetings, but do they have the information needed? Does it always have consistently concurrence documented in meeting summary on what the stakeholders thought of the concepts reviewed, and that they definitively agreed that, hey, this concept addresses the need? Is that in there in the meeting summary? Do we have the identified needs of the project and the purpose documented? Do we have clearly the scope of the work we're doing on this planning effort in that documentation? So we kind of came to the conclusion there are just a few, maybe 3 to 5 items that could add to the just the meeting summary of these kickoff meetings that could go a long ways downstream to helping out folks. And so, and again, I could use y'all's help in terms of your ideas for how we can improve this and add to it. Another idea mentioned from folks was enhanced documentation, and this could be in the project initiation form or the project scoping report, on if a project is addressing a short-term or long-term need. Perhaps we add that to the meeting summary as well, making sure that that's clearly spelled out and expectations are that when we're doing these projects, that's mentioned also. And then also, it's not just enough to invite stakeholders to a meeting, especially when it comes to MPOs and RPOs, if we're inviting them to these meetings, but we want to partner with them. And so some of the feedback I've heard from MPOs and RPOs is that they feel caught off guard sometimes when it's like we invite them to this random project kickoff meeting, and they're like, well, how the heck did this project come about? And so part of it is partnering with them in terms of having a work plan or a program of truly identifying the projects that are providing value based on what they've submitted. And so through this process of kind of having a working with them and the divisions to have a prioritized list of projects they need work on and clearly defining what those concepts are, and then turn having a work plan on how to complete those so that we're not catching some of them off guard in terms of having these meetings and kind of truly trying to hand that baton off. There's some holes sometimes between how we do things, between long-range planning with transportation planning vision and getting to us over here in feasibility studies unit and then handing it off again to project delivery. And so trying to identify what those are and make improvements for those. And so, yeah, we're not going to do the Q&A until the very end of this presentation. So if you have any thoughts, by all means, let me know then, or let's talk after, or feel free to reach out to me afterwards. And there's my email address and phone number. And I'm ready. John, are you ready? Yeah. Let me get your presentation up. Thank you for your time. The mouse is very sensitive.
Okay, so use the arrows. All right. Y'all let me know if you can't hear me okay. Thanks, Michael. All right, so as Matt said, I'm John Jameson with the Environmental Policy Unit. There's a lot of familiar faces in the audience, which honestly is a little intimidating because there's a lot of people in this audience that know a lot more about these things I'm going to talk about than me. So y'all feel free to ask questions, chime in with your thoughts. I want to hear audience participation. Roniel, since you're lurking in the back there, I want to make sure you're chiming in here too. I've known Roniel for 20 years, so got to pick on him. You can come down front and sit, Roniel. There's still some seats up here up front if y'all want to come up.
Sitting up here, John.
I know. So to tack on to what Matt was saying about scoping, in the environmental world, why does the scoping process matter? And I just want to make sure we touch on this because I think it is important. There's some huge benefits about what happens in the project scoping world when we get into the detailed NEPA review of a project. I mean, it gives us a big head start, let's just be honest. If we do it the right way, we're paying attention, we're reading the documents, and we're building on that documentation, it really helps things. It provides a consistent level of review, so we know kind of what's coming out of that process, and so we know what to expect. It gives the project team a great understanding of what the project is. So rather than having to go and like reinvent the wheel, figure it all out from scratch, it really helps there. It gives us a pretty clear course of where we're heading, and it helps to identify a lot of the risks. Instead of waiting to figure out what the project is and then figuring out risks later, it kind of gives you a lot of that stuff up front. So there's really a big benefit there. But we have to keep in mind the challenges that come along with it. You know, it's relying on clear communication of all that information. So if the documentation's not well written, or it's kind of sparse, or hard to understand, hard to find, it doesn't help much there. So we want to make sure things are providing some consistency there. So that good documentation is really important. And I really appreciate everything you're doing to bring some of that to light here and think about some improvements as well. That's awesome. It does leave some regulatory gaps. We're not going to figure everything out from a regulatory standpoint in scoping. We just need to realize that. There's not going to be conversations with agencies. At that stage, agencies aren't willing to come to the table and really say much. So there are going to be gaps there, and we need to understand that that's going to be the case, and we still need to dig into that a bit more. And it's not a comprehensive review, as Matt said. It's not a full NEPA review or anything, but it does give us a good head start. And as it says there, it documents where we've been, what we've done to date, and where we should be heading. Before I jump on that, I just will say, and Matt Clark said it earlier about project scope. Matt used the word scope a lot there, and I think it really is important, that need and purpose. And I know I like to talk about need and purpose, not purpose and need personally, because I think they go well in hand, and that need is what creates the purpose of the project. So we need to be talking about the needs of the community, the needs of the transportation network, in order to create that purpose statement. And that's what drives that scope that Matt Clark was, I think, touching on at the end of his talk this morning. So all that being said, there's a lot to talk about in the environmental world, so I'm just going to kind of dive in with some things here. We're going to bounce around a little bit. Bear with me. There's a lot of great people in the audience, like I said, that know more about some of these things, and so we want to hear the conversation at the end, so I'm trying to get to Q&A here as quick as we can, hopefully. So on the NEPA front, we signed a new CE agreement with Federal Highway back in October, and there are new CE templates. There's some changes that we made, nothing really major. We honestly have been meaning to do some training on this front, and I think honestly we've just been distracted by the hurricane response and some other things, changes at the federal level as well, to really roll that training out, but we need to get on that here shortly. But that's kind of why we're here today, is to touch on some of these things. For our NEPA documentation, most of y'all know that we do consultations. That a NEPA consultation is required as you head toward right-of-way or toward construction. There's fewer triggers under the new agreement for when consultations are required. So that is an important thing to keep in mind. In the past, we were doing probably more consultations than we really needed to, so we had a hard conversation with Federal Highways and worked that out to where we were doing a few less, hopefully, on projects moving forward. A few of the questions in some of the CEs got clarified a bit. That was mostly from input from staff and consultants. If there are other questions that y'all feel like need to be sort of tweaked a bit more, we're going to be reopening these templates thanks to the new administration in DC. So there's going to be some changes made to these here shortly. So let us know if you have suggestions for how to better phrase something, improve a question. And we have added this, you can see on the right there in this screenshot, the little documentation piece at the end of each question. That's a combination of requests that have been made to try to keep track of these things. It helps to keep CEs smaller. It keeps us from having to attach a lot of documents to a CE. But it also gives us a clear reference of when you were answering this question at this date, this is what you were looking at. You know, you were looking at this NRTR from 2018 when you did this CE in 2024. That's important for us to know. That way we know that 2018 NRTR is getting kind of old now. You know, maybe when we do a consultation, we need to make sure we've got good natural resources information that's been updated. So that's why that's there. We're trying to make it easy. We want it to be easy. We want it to be you're already looking at the document when you answer the question, just drop a hyperlink in there and roll on. It shouldn't be a heavy lift. So I mentioned there's obviously a lot of changes at the national level here. I'll touch on these really quickly because honestly this is changing on a daily basis. Obviously there's changes at CEQ. For those of y'all not in the NEPA world, the Council on Environmental Quality is the White House office that oversees NEPA for the federal government. Essentially, combination of factors, the White House and then also a lost court case means CEQ is probably backing away from being a regulatory authority and more of a guidance-driven agency, or I'm sorry, they're not an agency, office. So what you'll see out of CEQ moving forward is not regulations most likely, it'll be just guidance and procedures, process kind of oriented things. In the past, CEQ has been the guardrail for all the other federal agencies. They kind of give the agencies a lot of leeway, but also give them clear guidance about what they should or should not be doing. In the past, that's been in regulations. Now moving forward, it's probably not going to be in regulation. Some various executive orders and then also just some policy-driven things coming out of some of the agencies means that we're probably not going to be using some of these terms that are on the screen currently. Environmental justice, equity, climate change. In general, we're probably not going to be talking about those as much. That doesn't mean we're not talking about them at all. It just means at the federal level, they probably won't have any emphasis whatsoever. At the state level, we may still have an interest. You know, we still have environmental justice focused executive orders from our governor that still apply. So we need to be mindful of maybe we're not talking about it from a federal light, but we are still talking about it in North Carolina from our perspective. So there's going to be a lot of figuring this out along the way. We don't know all the answers here. We obviously do know that the term equity is in there in that DEI conversation happening at the national level. Doesn't mean we completely wash our hands of the term equity, but it does mean that we're probably not using it in some of our federal documentation at times. And then there's other changes still coming from executive orders. It's hard to say what's next. I threw this one up here on the screen as a screenshot just as an example. In the headlines, it's talking about California and disaster response, but there was a whole half a page in here about I-40 and the Pigeon River Gorge in North Carolina in that executive order, which actually has made a pretty big difference in some of the regulatory hurdles we've been dealing with on I-40. So we need to be paying attention to everything that comes out of the White House right now. So on the Helene front, what's the latest post-Helene? So some of the current trends that we're seeing and dealing with, and there's some folks in the audience that know more about this than me. I know Mike Sanderson is dealing with us on a daily basis in Division 13. So we're past the point of doing after-the-fact permitting. For the first 3 or 4 months, we were doing a ton of work out there, trying to repair roads just to get access to people, to their homes, to their businesses. So we weren't worrying about permitting. We were kind of keeping an eye on things environmentally, but not really taking any regulatory action with the agencies for the most part, because there was just so much to be done that everybody said just deal with that later. But we're kind of past that point now. We're needing to get permits before we take action moving forward. There shouldn't really be anything moving forward that we're just going out there with equipment in streams or rivers without having permits in advance. So we're learning a lot about CMGC and progressive design build right now. Who all is involved in a CMGC or a progressive design build contract or project? Yeah, a lot of hands. So there's a lot of good and bad to it. It's great in that it gives us a chance to get out there and start rolling. It's a phased construction process essentially, so they're dealing with issuing work packages. The design and construction are happening at the same time. I can tell you it's a huge headache from an environmental standpoint to keep track of it all, because we're really never sure what's happening on any given day. But communication is the important part. Knowing what's happening, knowing what's coming next, knowing what's included in work packages, keeping up with permits, and being willing to do phased permitting in a lot of cases, or even iterative permitting where we're permitting one action as part of the project and then we're permitting another action as the work packages roll through. We have to kind of be willing to roll with those punches along the way. It's not simple. I think everybody's learning right now, from environmental staff to the resident engineers to our designers. But just know that that's a work in progress, and bear with us, I think, as we work through that. There's a lot of projects going into construction right now. A ton of, Mike's nodding his head. I'm guessing, Mike, your head's spinning with projects that are going to be let soon or already getting let. And the agencies are starting to get a better grasp of where all this stands. I would say they were asking for a lot of information, and I think they probably were seeing what was in the news, but not really knowing what we were doing on a day-to-day basis, because honestly, we just didn't have time to clearly communicate that in a lot of cases. We've been heavily reliant on division environmental staff to be doing a lot of that communication. And the agencies are kind of catching up now, I think, and understanding what's going on. And with the CMGC and progressive design build and some of the other efforts, figuring out how this stuff's going to work. So there's been a lot of conversations there and a lot more to come. As far as lessons learned on the Helene front, keep in mind Federal Highway puts a lot of trust in us, and so we're taking a lot of actions on their behalf. We're staying in communication with them, but also they're saying, just go and do. Y'all, NCDOT, you're doing the right things, keep going. FEMA, on the other hand, doesn't really know NCDOT, doesn't know our people, doesn't know our processes. So they're a lot more methodical. They don't have that background information, so it's been kind of a learning curve with FEMA, I will say. There's definitely a need for more coordination early on when we have these disasters, and a lot of people have already learned these lessons. I'm sure Jay, Paul down east and Divisions 2 and 1, and y'all have done this in the past, so you have a better feel for it. But coordinating with the agencies and figuring out, coordinating internally with DOT staff as well, figuring out who's going to cover projects, who's going to do which things at which times. It's really important, and we can definitely do better on that front. Programmatic approaches are really important. We're figuring out that if we can sign programmatic agreements, have MOUs in place. We had a FEMA work plan, for instance, that was pretty good, but day one when FEMA came to us, they said, hey, we want to update that work plan. And we're kind of like, why do we want to update that work plan? It's kind of already working and everybody knows what it is. So we've contemplated making some tweaks there, but we don't want to overhaul it midstream when we're already dealing with the disaster response as it is. And then it's difficult to determine what level of effort is really necessary on some of these Helene efforts when it's not our normal process. We don't know how long is it going to take to do a CE, how long is it going to take to get a permit. It could be a day, and it could be a month, and it could be 3 months. We're not really sure. We're kind of working through that. We've gotten CEs done in 1 day, and we've gotten permits issued, overnight. But that's not our normal process, and we can't rely on that on every project or in every disaster response case. So moving on, like I said, I'm going to cover a few different topics. Endangered species right now. There's a lot of changes happening there. And there's a few folks in the back of the room there that know a lot more about this stuff. So feel free to raise your hand and chime in on anything you want. But from a streamlining process, from a Helene standpoint, we've standardized some of our avoidance minimization measures and our conservation measures as we've been talking to Fish and Wildlife Service about these projects, which has been helpful. Our biological surveys group and our division staff have done a lot of batching of similar type of projects under single consultations. That's been really important to get done. I think it's helped with the workload at Fish and Wildlife Service, and it's also helped us, keep things under control a little bit better. There's some new proposed listings that came out in December, and with the administration, it's hard to say what happens next with this, but I want everybody to be mindful of the monarch butterfly and the eastern hellbender proposed listings that are out there right now. So these are just a few thoughts from the central perspective. Divisions may be handling this a little bit differently at times, but keep in mind that with a proposed listing, there's no restrictions that immediately take effect. So there is some time delay essentially here to work through. So nothing is happening imminently. With that being said, proposed species don't receive protection until they're actually listed. So as long as there's no potential jeopardy of that species with our action, we can proceed without having to necessarily do anything on that species. That's a conversation that we need to be having as an agency. I don't think we want any consultants just making that decision on our behalf, but it's a risk-based decision that we want to take on. And of course, we take it on behalf of our federal agencies. So they may want to consult with Fish and Wildlife on a conference opinion. They may not. Every agency seems to be kind of doing things a little bit differently and figuring this out as we go along on this process. So we're all kind of learning what their preferences are and what we feel like is most appropriate. IPAC, if IPAC lists the monarch butterfly in the project area, DOT staff may develop conservation measures related to the monarch butterfly, and we may want to implement that. We may hold off on it. We may just kind of keep it in the back of our mind, or a little memo to file or something like that. We'll see. On the hellbender front, obviously that's more of a mountainous species there that we're working through. So we may voluntarily coordinate with the Wildlife Resource Commission and figure out where we need to assess populations and possibly relocate hellbenders. But that's going to be project by project. Kevin, Amy, trying to think who else, Mike, maybe Jeff, y'all are all dealing with that. And you probably have division protocols that you're kind of working through. I'm not sure if everybody's on the same page on the Hellbender or not as to how we're approaching that. So, keep that in mind, be talking to your division environmental staff and central staff as needed there. The Western BAT programmatic that I think we've probably mostly all heard about this in one way, shape, or form. In the East, we've got a lot of programmatic biological opinions with Fish and Wildlife Service. In the West, we have not historically, but we do have a Western BAT programmatic that is in final review right now. We certainly expect that document in the coming weeks, and we're not talking about months anymore, we're talking about weeks. We have seen final versions of it, and I think everybody feels relatively comfortable that's going to happen. We're still not completely happy with the language that's in it, but we're getting really close. And there's been some revisions to the Eastern Aquatic PBO. Nothing major there, a few terminology changes. Just wanted y'all to be aware of that. So what's going on with 4F? I feel like 4F is coming up more and more. I'm not really sure if that's just where I sit in the organization or if it's just we have more widening projects that are dealing with 4F. But just a reminder, the Federal Highway website and guidance is still a great resource for everybody on the 4F front. We do have a guidance document that is essentially finalized, and we have templates that are drafted and just about ready for posting. There is a need for some critical review of 4F resources. We don't want to make assumptions on these things. DOT staff need to be paying attention to what's happening on the 4F front and making sure that we're making the right assumptions and right decisions. Just a few of the examples of mistakes that we've made in the past so we can learn from those. There's been times where we've assumed that resources are 4F when they aren't, which sometimes it's not a big deal, sometimes it kind of is a big deal. It may drive a project's decision making. There's been times where we're not addressing the net benefits of our action to that recreational resource. We're just kind of focusing on the negative impacts, but also we're bringing a lot of positives to that resource, and we need to remind everybody of that and document it appropriately too. There's certainly been times where we're not doing enough to avoid and minimize impacts. I'm guessing on the design front, that may be a lack of knowledge about 4F, but we need to work as a team to make sure that we're avoiding and minimizing appropriately when we have 4F resources out there. And then we want to make sure we're using the right 4F evaluations. There's certainly been times where we've had programmatic evaluations that were used that we could have done a de minimis finding instead, which de minimis is a little bit simpler. They're not drastically different, but Federal Highways really wants us to be doing the right 4F documentation. They don't want to be having their name associated with us doing it in the wrong way. So I want everybody to be mindful of that. And then just throwing this up here as an example, we have a new flow chart that we've drafted up. Can't read it on the screen, sorry, but it'll be up on the website. This isn't quite final, but it's a whole lot easier when you look at it on a PDF and zoom in on whatever you need. But it does help understand sort of different people's roles and also how the process should play out on the 4F front. So what else is new? A lot of stuff. I know I feel like Homer, and it's not just because I kind of look like him with my hairline. But just, I want everybody to be mindful. If you haven't had a conversation with a federal employee lately, they're worried. They're timid about things. They're honestly, working with one hand tied behind their back, I'd say, if they're even still there at all. There's a few that we have lost. They've been let go in the past couple of months. I know I had a meeting 4 weeks ago with the Forest Service, and one of the people sitting across the table from me was gone the next day. So we want to be mindful of that. It's not an easy place to work right now. So bring a little bit of grace to those conversations if you can. It's difficult to get anything in writing from a federal agency right now. Want everybody to be aware of that. Phone conversations are great, but you can only do so much with a phone conversation. And honestly, the folks at Federal Highway right now are so busy that it's hard to get them on the phone. I've had I've been trading a lot of text messages and stuff with Clarence and George and others at Federal Highway, and that's intentional because, they don't want to send emails. They don't have time for phone conversations, but while they're in meetings, they can shoot us a text. So there's different ways of working through that. There are a lot of legal challenges happening, which creates a moving target for us. I mean, most of us have been dealing with legal challenges in the past, but truly, it's hard to know what our next steps need to be when things are tied up in court. So it creates a lot of risks for our projects, in my opinion. So things like environmental justice, things like CEQ guidance. We don't know what the rules of the road are right now. So we're trying to work through that and be mindful of that as we take those next steps in our projects. Our grant programs, in most cases from the federal government, are paused or they're canceled entirely. Be mindful of that fact. Everything's out of our control right now. Protect funding, for instance, I hear a lot of questions about Protect funds. We think that the Protect program is coming back, but we don't know what it's going to look like. It may change names, it may change priorities. It may come back just like it was. We're not really sure. Other hot topics, FERC continues to be of interest. I think most of the FERC lakes seem to have gotten filled about the same time back in the 30s, 40s, 50s. So our bridges that crossed all those lakes are all coming due for replacement. So we have a ton of FERC-related coordination going on. We're still looking for streamlining opportunities there. If you have any ideas, if you've worked on a FERC project, see Charles Cox in the audience, like if you worked on a FERC project 20 years ago and you're like, I've got this silver bullet in my back pocket that I know about from dealing with Duke Energy, feel free to let us know. We're willing to talk about anything on the FERC front right now. Our 106 programmatic agreement expires at the end of the year. That renewal is underway. I know Jamie and Randy and probably others are working on that right now with Renee, and I don't think we expect any big changes there. And then the 404 regional general permits are expiring in May, but I think those replacement 404, 401s are pretty much ready to go. I think we provided some comments to Division of Water Resources on the 401s, and they appreciated getting those comments from us. Hopefully they take them and make use of our comments there. So with that, I know we have plenty of time for questions, it looks like, and I think that's all I've got. So I appreciate your time, and thank you, and we'll take some questions.
Does anyone have any questions? This is where I'm serving my double role as both the moderator and speaker.
So Matt, you mentioned fatal flaws several times. I just wanted to see if you could talk about what are your most common fatal flaws, and are there ways to mitigate some of those through, better design, more design, those kinds of things?
Thanks for your question. So as far as fatal flaws, it really depends on what the project context is in terms of what potential fatal flaws can be. I'll say that really just poor communication can be one of the biggest ones, and maybe moving along on a certain design that might not be appropriate, and so you end up with some tough decisions down the road of, so say you do traffic analysis in the year 2050 and you determine, oh, this isn't going to meet that traffic analysis. Do you build out more to address that? And that gets into a conversation of if it's a long-term or short-term need, because if you have that clearly documented earlier, then you can more easily and efficiently make those decisions on a little bit, are we trying to build out and kind of go with this more design, or do you need to pull back some and go with more of a condensed design? And sometimes that also ties into understanding what the primary need driving the purpose of it. I mentioned an example with like safety versus traffic. And so sometimes just understanding some of those early items to help inform your decision making down the road, make it easier for yourself to avoid impasses downstream. Does does that maybe touch on some of what you were? Okay, good. Okay, who else? Yes, Lauren.
So my question, I think, kind of is the bridge between the two groups here. So what is kind of the current mindset around like a complex corridor that maybe has 4 or 5 spot IDs as they're all linked together. So the deliverable for that being one maybe long form report versus individuals, and then how does that play into the recommendations for how to proceed with NEPA or SEPA from a project expense standpoint? Because I know funding for big corridor projects is less available, so we're kind of running into smaller projects, but we're doing this comprehensive look. So just kind of, there was a 2-in-1, I guess.
That's a great question, Lauren. And so I want to say, I hope that those issues of multiple spot IDs will get better over time. And part of that is through improved organization on our end. And I see Ellen and Lisa in the audience, well, they're helping us put together improved database for keeping track of our projects. Some of the issues you can't find what the heck these old spot IDs are, Warren. And so you're like, okay, no, like this spot ID became that spot ID, which then became that. Oh, and there's this adjacent spot ID that also has 2 spot IDs. And so we're working with the idea to improve our organization ability to tag multiple spot IDs to one kind of overarching ID in our database so that even if the spot IDs change or you get multiple ones added to it, you'll always have that consistent ability to come back to it and not lose that project appropriate information into it. And so you'll have this building repository of it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's going to have to be on a case-by-case basis. I don't know if I can paint with a broad brush here for the purposes of this presentation. What I'll say is it requires careful communication, coordination with the submitters, with your stakeholders, and a clear understanding of what are you trying to achieve. Are you simply doing something to understand one project to answer a question for a submitter, but just so they can determine if it's viable to submit? Or are you, and maybe a little further on downstream in the process, maybe in the realm of project scoping report or something, where you're trying to bring it all home and bring it all together, and you truly want to have one giant report for everything. And so that's my best way to kind of dance around your question some, to say that it varies and depends on the context situation. John, you want to?
I mean, it definitely has, permitting and NEPA connotations as well there. So, in general, we want to lump those together and study them as one if we feel like the action is going to be lumped together from a purpose and need standpoint. But if you can separate them cleanly, whether it's because of purpose and need or some other factors, that's okay. We're doing a lot of splitting right now and trying to justify splitting. Some of those are a lot cleaner than others. And some we've gotten a little bit of pushback from Federal Highways on, honestly, and sometimes we don't want to get to the point where we get pushback from the Corps of Engineers, but that has happened too. So we want to be mindful of that and go ahead and have that tough conversation up front if we can to figure that out. But yeah, there's a bit of strategy there to it.
Anyone else? Okay, well, as I'm dismissing y'all, let me pull up the QR code for you guys so you can scan it for your PDHs. And what I'll say is I hope this isn't the last I hear from some of you guys. Again, we really are looking to make improvements, at least from feasibility studies unit end, and I know John as well. Yeah, we welcome your feedback for opportunities for improvement. But if no further questions, you are dismissed, and hope you all have a great rest of the day.